4 as of last week. We sold 2 of them out in the East Coast.
There we go.
There we go. So I think for me the show was an excellent show. I skipped out on last year, so coming back this year was kind of I was able to go with a fresh set of eyes. And I think first of all we had about 94,000 people show up this year, which to me is a very healthy attendance, considering that most people are saying that television's having a hard time and radio's having a hard time. To see 94,000 people at a show like NEB is encouraging. So to me, it left a really good impression that I think we're still in a very healthy business. I think we've talked about this year being a year of mergers and acquisitions with companies, and we talked about the Miranda name has now gone off the floor, which is kind of sad. I remember that French-Canadian company starting up about 20 years ago, and that name was completely off the floor. In Applied's office in Quebec, exactly, right? So that's how far back it goes. Harris, of course, is now called Imagine, and at the floor, the Friday before NEB, they purchased Digital Rapids, which is a big acquisition for them. And they spun off their transmitter division into a company called Gates Air, which in 30 years I've never heard of before. But they said it was a big brand name. I've never heard of it. So other purchases, Quantel purchasing Snell, Ross purchasing Unreal Virtual Technology. Calrec was purchased by a venture capitalist company called Electra, which owns Allen Heath. And then there were rumors about Avid squandering their money and closing their doors. But if you went to the booth at their floor, it was an extremely busy booth, and you couldn't tell that Avid was having any financial difficulties. So it was an interesting year for that. And Paul mentioned that there's more to come. And he probably knows more about this than we do because he has all these business relationships that we don't. My main focus for NEB this year was to look at MAM hardware and software, but I tried to look at other things as well because Andrew approached me before the NEB and said, "Do you mind sitting down?" I said, "Sure enough." So I'm trying to give you my 2 cents worth, my perspective, and what I pulled out of this year's show was basically 4 common themes. Some of you heard already. It's a software world, 4K applications, low-cost production tools, and IP networks as opposed to video circuits. To that extent, when it came to the software world, wherever I went at one of the NEB booths, I tried to stick my head into their equipment room. And most people agreed to me to take a peek in their equipment room, and 9 times out of 10 was nothing but servers inside there. Very low proprietary technology. It was either Dell or HP, or one of the big brand names like IBM, and there's video cards and typical network connections to this stuff. So very few people are making hardware specific for the broadcast environment. It's basically commodity products. When it came to 4K, wonderful picture quality, one application I saw, which was sports driven, was basically meshing 2 cameras together on a wide shot at a sports stadium, and then being able to zoom in and basically pull an HD image out of that. Fantastic stuff. It was like I saw one demonstration where they had this application at the bottom of a helicopter, and they shot an F1 race. And the helicopter just hovered there and it shot the whole circuit. So if any camera missed the scene, this helicopter basically filled in. And that was a practical application for 4K. It wasn't all that expensive. It was probably more expensive to rent the helicopter for the day than it was for the 4K technology. I would say 4K as a broadcast tool is probably, it's getting there, but 4K as a post-production tool, for sure it's there. If I was running a post house, I would generate the highest possible picture quality that I could. 8K is coming down the pipe. I would adopt 8K. If you can create your content in the highest resolution, that means it's future-proof as you go down the road. There's a few examples of 4K and JPEG compression and trying to shove multiple 4K images down a 10 gig link. This one I saw at the Ebert's booth, and they were successful in, I think, shoving 4K images down a 10 gig link using JPEG compression, low latency. I thought that was pretty cool. Couldn't figure out where to use it, but I thought it was cool anyways. And lastly was, again, using super high resolution 4K to feed monitors on sets, for instance, where you get a much better punch when you have high resolution sets, on high resolution monitors on your sets for television, for instance. That's just, if you ever look at the newscast using just even regular HD, it kind of looks a bit soft. This thing just made a big difference in my opinion. So there's some practical applications for 4K that I think for broadcast, and I think just a matter of time before 4K broadcast equipment becomes economical, practical, and sets new trends. Low-cost production tools. 4K cameras from all the big manufacturers, recorders, routers, and monitors. The big guys like Blackmagic, Data Video, Sony, Canon, JVC, Panasonic, they all have 4K cameras for less than $10,000. Impressive picture quality, but they felt flimsy in your hand. They felt cheap. So will they last long when you give it to a camera guy on the field? Probably not. Maybe it's a good thing because technology is changing so quickly. So it was an interesting solution. About all this low-cost production equipment, it's a great problem solvers for people on a limited budget. If you have to build a new facility, or if it's a facility is disposable, I think of live eyes and news production. If a guy driving a live eye truck off a cliff, it's like, okay, no big deal. It's only 4K stuff that came from these manufacturers. Or it's amazing what the live eye guys can get themselves into. But again, there's a lot of high picture quality, low cost production, low cost tools that can solve a lot of problems for you. Another thing that I noticed was that Apple was nowhere to be seen on this floor, whereas a few years ago they had a big booth. Final Cut Pro was big. This year it was Adobe, and their equivalent to Final Cut Pro. Adobe was big. So kind of disappointing that Apple came into this business big time and then they just disappeared just as quickly, leaving a legacy behind the users who use Final Cut Pro to edit, and universities and colleges teach this stuff. And so what I found out from the Adobe booth is that there's a growing trend towards universities and colleges to start teaching Adobe. The kids are interested in it. And surprisingly enough, not Final Cut Pro, not Avid, nor anything else. They're switching to Adobe as an educational tool. Switching gears here, we talked about fiber optic plants or IP-based plants facilities. And as Jim mentioned, Evertz had a great example of basically a fiber optic router for IP switching. And when I was writing this document, it occurred to me that the guys that run my radio stations have been doing this for years. They've been hooking up equipment with Ethernet connections for the past 10 years. And over this simple Ethernet connection, they have audio files, they have metadata, they have automation, they have everything in a matter of just a minute of hooking up an Ethernet connection. And I'm just working on a radio project, and I asked the guy, well, why aren't you buying XLR connectors? He says, well, we don't use XLR connectors anymore because everything's IP-based. So I think the rule of thumb that I've always had is if you want to know what's happening in the television business, look at the radio business, because we're going to be there in about 5 to 10 years after the fact. So I think we're on the right track to using IP infrastructure for our plants, because with a single, it could be an Ethernet connection or fiber optic connection, you're going to get the same benefits that radio stations have today. It's going to be bi-directional, you'll be able to support metadata, automation, control, phone systems, intercoms, whatever you can throw at it, I think it's the way to go. And again, many of the other manufacturers are talking about going the same, like Sony, Harris, for instance, or Imagine, they mentioned the same thing, that they're going to this IP core infrastructure. So again, I think it makes sense to take advantage of off-the-shelf commodity items. Just means we can do a lot less money because we're just being forced to do so. Evertz had an interesting software application that I think I didn't understand it correctly, but it looked at something called more like a data harvesting application, where, and this goes back to IP networks and so on. So if you're creating video content, that they have this application that would go out to the internet and harvest every piece of data it can find on a piece of video that you might be working on. And I said, that's a great idea, but the alarm bells went on in terms of digital rights management and things like that nature. But I think if they can actually pull this off, it can be very useful for people who are editing content and just creating metadata for that content, basically in the background, without putting a lot of labor behind it, and making sure that the content is meaningful so you can search it in the future. But like I said to myself, this is great because now you can be harvesting data from sites that are probably registered or blacklisted, so you got to be careful with that. Switching gears again, something that the Ross people showed was this open truck concept. I thought it was pretty cool because basically the truck is maybe the best way to call it is a template. It's a Sprinter van, and it's equipped with a production switcher and a monitor wall. It's all based on Ross open gear platforms. But I just saw it as a way of stealing their plans and using it for a control room if you wanted to. So I think maybe someone from Ross can answer the question here, because I think the plans are downloadable. I don't know if it's free or not, but there's probably a marginal charge. But it's a great way to build the live eye, and because it uses Ross Open Gear, you can pick and choose from all the vendors. Of course, Ross probably wants you to buy Ross equipment, but you can choose multiple vendors to do that. I think it's a great idea. I think it's it has the potential to shake up the industry for smaller venues. I'm looking at Mike Johnson here from Dome, probably doesn't want to hear that. But I thought it was pretty interesting that they basically built a template for these smaller venues that where a 53-foot truck can't fit in, or it just doesn't make sense from a financial point of view. Switching back to sports software, there was one piece of software from Chiron, which I believe is called Sports Data, which has the ability to basically geo-track players on the field. And what these guys did was pretty cool. Was depending if you can convince the team or not, they basically had the players wear little RFID devices. And so once the player board this, it would start tracking the player on the field. And the real funky part was you'd see these names pop up on the screen, and it will track the player no matter where they went. But the person that was giving the demo to us that morning was a coach of a team out of Florida. And he was using the same system to collect data on his players. Who ran the fastest? Who was the slowest? Who was getting hit the most often? Who had a good game? Who had a bad game? And all this metadata was being built up, courtesy of this piece of Chiron software, which I thought was pretty cool. It's like not only was it a broadcast tool, it's also a very intuitive coaching tool. And so I was quite impressed by it. Again, more sports software. The VizRT Libero system, which is again a telestrator type thing, but it's more like a telestrator on steroids, where you can easily build different types of graphics, different types of features. It can track players. It just does a whole bunch of wonderful things that your on-air talent is supposed to use and hopefully make the sport more engaging. I saw a hockey demonstration, Martian hockey. I think they flubbed it. I don't think you should touch hockey. That's my personal opinion, but so but they did a great example of football. They did a great example of European soccer that I think will make the sport much more engaging. Lastly, I did mention that I went down there to look at MAM hardware, and I did spend quite a bit of time looking at MAM hardware. LTO7 drives are on the horizon. They're about to be released soon. So not only do you get 6.4 terabytes of storage on a little cassette like this, which is good for about 180 3-hour digital beta cam tapes on one tape, but you also get tremendous throughput. So we talked about using a tape device to stream content back into a spinning disk storage device. The throughput's there to basically fill storage up in a matter of seconds. Very practical. LTO8 is waiting in the backgrounds to come out as well. So it'll probably be about probably 16 months after LTO7 comes out. Again, high data rates, high record capacities. Lastly, I'm just going to finish off in regards into hard drive storage. Again, SSD drives, which is common nowadays, is making it big in large commodity and large enterprise services. They're become more cost effective. They're bigger in capacity, so people are switching to SSD drives for anything that requires a high throughput. And there's also improvements in just typical spinning disk hard drives. And a lot of things I heard about down there was basically referred to as Tier 1 and Tier 2 storage. Again, this is hard drive with SSD drive-based storage. Tier 1 is typically referred to as massive throughput. If you want to have a whole bunch of users pushing and pulling high-res content, you start off with a Tier 1 storage. Then there's Tier 2 storage, which is basically large quantities of storage, but not as fast. And one great example of that was basically Nexen. That was down there, and out of a storage, out of a 4RU unit, they had supposed to fill 240 terabytes. The drives came out of drawers like this, and I thought it was very economical compared to just something that we saw a few years ago. So that kind of wraps it up for me. Again, like I said, my takeaway was it's a software world, 4K was everywhere, low-cost reduction tools, and IP networks for an AV.
Thanks, Frank. So just before Paul starts, so if I get this right, TV is just radio with more bandwidth.
Absolutely.
And pictures.
And pictures. Oh yeah.
Pictures, yeah.
Over to you, Paul.
Not bad. I got to being fifth, and most of my stuff wasn't mentioned. So yeah, or at least I'll take a different swing at it. Yeah, the vendor consolidation for us being on that side of it was quite something. I don't know that I'll ever get used to a purple GB logo, but it was interesting not only for what we saw, but for what I heard in the background. You know, we started to look at vendors now. Who's owned by a venture capital company, who's not owned by a venture capital company, because anybody who's owned by a venture capital company is owned for a reason. So when Imagine gets split to, and I still can't get used to a verb as a name. I kept joking with them, I want their logo to stop staring at me. But obviously when you see things like them splitting the company apart, you know, when a venture capital company does that, they do that for very specific reasons. But obviously the Miranda GV exercise will be an interesting experiment. It's whether or not, you know, the era of the one company trying to be your end-to-end supplier can stay best in breed in all those various things they sell. Snell, Digital Rapids, a company that we deal with called Amberfin. I forgot about Calrec, again, they were sold. So, and also some of the things we were hearing in the back rooms, you know, I think there's a lot more of this to come. We're seeing basically a dichotomy of the two worlds of broadcast now. We're seeing the SDI world being threatened by the software world. A lot of the software guys don't have to be big. It seems that a lot of companies under 50 are making some of the neatest, funkiest software. So there doesn't appear to be any advantage to scale. And in fact, I talked to some of these software companies, and they say, you know, the bigger you are, the harder it is to make good software. But a lot coming from the gaming industry. You see a lot of fresh, new, small companies making some pretty innovative software. To me, this was the most profound NAB I can remember for a lot of reasons. Certainly from what the customers were saying versus past years. But the vendor consolidation, I don't think we've nearly seen the end of it. If you told me that we'll see as much next year and the year after, I would be surprised. I talked to a couple of suppliers. They didn't know whether they were going to be bought or whether they would buy somebody first. But it appears that there's still a lot of moving and shaking as we see one world perhaps shrink a little on the SDI side and the software side growing. The 4K, I thought there was a remarkable absence of the actual television term UHD1. Everybody was talking about 4K versus the 3840. If you remember, I think it's kind of funny if you remember the origins of 16:9. The computer people in the early days said, we're going to be big one day. We think you should make your picture more square. The film guys said, no, our stuff's wider. So that neither would win, they made a compromise that neither uses. So UHD1, and being a little bit cynical and watching the UHD1 phrase come out of nowhere last fall, everything was headed towards the NHK 8K standard, and then all of a sudden 4K started to become prevalent here now. Everybody's adopting it, so they rather hastily came up with the UHD1, UHD2 designation. So I don't know how much momentum the 8K's got. Certainly 4K, as I point out, that when we're coming from a resolution, when we went to HD, everything was 4 times the price. We're going to something where everything's cheaper now. You get 10 LTO 6 tapes, as I pointed out, can hold 20 hours of raw 4K and can do so for about 50 cents a minute, which is about $2 for SR tape. So there is no practical issue anymore. I think the biggest thing that UHD1 is facing is actually going to be the consumer television, the consumer connectivity. HDMI blew it, and HDMI 2 isn't really going to cut it either. For what I hear in my SMPTE circles, that by the end of this year, the HEVC and the payloads decided to be about 15 megabits. Nobody wants to launch and this is nothing you don't hear much of, nobody wants to launch UHD1 in 8-bit, everyone wants it to be at least 10-bit. And I'm forgetting whether this initial launch is going to be in 60 or 120 frames, but most people say there's not much point in introducing it under 120 frames. The biggest connectivity right now, things like dual display port, quad display port can do that. HDMI is pretty well dead in the water. So the set-top boxes should be out in the spring, and how, you know, that's from the development side when they'll be able to show the stuff, so the head-end encoders. In the fall, everybody was, and you heard a lot of people talking at the show about Netflix doing all their mastering in 4K, all their original series will be mastered in 4K. the story is, will their non-real-time delivery or their real-time delivery capabilities, will it sneak up and will they start to do it before television can do it over the air? The answer is probably yes. Again, through SMPTE contacts, CBS is going to switch all. They were already 70% 3K aerial Alexa or 4K already. They're going to convert their remaining productions over. Certainly in the sports world, you saw a lot of stuff about image stitching, being able to put a couple of standard cameras, 4K cameras, and then do image stitching and seamlessly go across the images. It's interesting to talk about the RF tags, and I don't think CBS reveals it, but for the last 2 years in NFL, they actually have software, and like I say, I don't think they talk about who it is and where they get it. They actually look at the numbers on the jersey and then track it from last known position. So it screws up from time to time, but it's still a great way without actually having to alter the players. But certainly some of that image recognition. But certainly one of the things I heard a lot of the client base talking about is, okay, the powers that own us have come down and said, you've got to start obviously getting into OTT type deliveries, creating different versions, different platforms. How do I get to one workflow that distributes amongst all the platforms is common. The asset management, one of the common themes for doing that. But then everybody's trying to think about how to monetize it. So one of the uses of UHD and 4K is to basically grab a larger field of view such that you watch your hockey game, and then you can have secondary views of your player picture-in-picture. And so a lot of people are looking at different ways to produce that content quickly. So taking the second screen, as in the tablet you're holding while you're watching your first screen, and secondary content being stuff that's viewed after the fact, and trying to provide alternate views, alternate packaging for all their non-television. So I heard a lot of people saying, we're here to look at things that will monetize our webcasts and secondary content. And again, the whole UHD 4K workflow, not many people I still think this SMPTE standard for new SDI, I think it, hide my SMPTE badge here so it doesn't cry, but I think that it's going to be almost the equivalent of the post office raising the rates. It's the last straw that makes you get over it. Everybody's just wired for 3 gig. The different form factors for 6, 12, and 24 gig. Certainly they'll make the getting off the camera. So I think we'll adopt the new SDI format. Will we adopt it in cables longer than this big to get to your RAM pack? I'm not sure. A really big trend, software replacing hardware. We're really seeing there's, short of the cameras, there's really not much we can't replace with software anymore. And really software, I refer to it as the third version of the third generation of IT conversion. We started with servers in the 90s. We got to software running on non-proprietary hardware. Now we're really going to a virtualized world. And I hate the word cloud, and a lot of these legacy vendors and a lot of vendors decided to put clouds on the side of their booths, and we're showing some sort of technology demonstration of something or another in the cloud. It just appears that you had to say that. To me, I don't see the cloud being relevant to the broadcast business, and it was curious to see both Grass Valley and Imagine showing hosted playout systems. I didn't really see, they're talking about being able to host your master control in their cloud, and so it's their attempt to try to charge a monthly fee for services rather than try to sell you a playout device anymore. If you're looking at some of the prices of these software-based playout devices now, no wonder they want to do that, because some of the software-based playout devices are getting so darn inexpensive, and a lot of them are starting to work pretty well. But it was certainly an odd idea. I found myself thinking a lot about the Canadian market, especially with the Grass Valley one. Their pitch was, we're going to help you regionalize all of your bandwidth is expensive, so this is a way to stick your playout and dribble down that material and play out 80 some odd hours from these blade cards in the regions. And I kind of thought, well, that was kind of a 2006 problem. 70% of our business is now owned by telcos. Bandwidth really isn't an issue for the broadcast business in Canada. It's also 100% regulated as to how much you can regionalize and substitute content. So it'll be interesting to see how, whether some of the customers here decide to go out and shut off your own master controls and farm it out. Pardon me?
Customers who also have
owned by telcos, sure. Yes. So really seeing the trend in software increasing, but also virtualized software. Instead of seeing a transcoder stuck on a device, we're seeing you invoke a transcoder license, you invoke a QC license, you invoke an edit license. Adobe, of course, going to mostly virtualized. I really didn't know what to expect with the consolidation on the client side. So many of the Canadian ownership entities own so much of our business. They just don't need to send as many people down. So from the Canadian standpoint, I think we actually saw fewer people, although I really felt like the show was crowded throughout the entire duration of the show. It seemed big, busy, and crowded this year. I certainly the South Hall. Lots of talk about pricing, about how the prices are declining, and who can cope with some of these sharp price decreases. It is thought, and most people agree, that the broadcast business did something last year it has never done in its history, that is shrink. So it's down to probably something less than 25 billion, maybe 22, 23 billion. To put it in perspective, EMC as a company is larger than the worldwide broadcast business. Cisco is 2.5 times larger than the worldwide broadcast business. So we really are quite a small industry, especially when you compare it to Infocom, the show that'll be in Las Vegas. The AV business is at least 4 times the size of the broadcast business. But yeah, a lot of talk about how cheap things are getting. Certainly doesn't look like there's going to be much in the way of a 4K camera over $10,000. It's like somebody flipped a switch and everybody's talking about rights management. It appears that the traditional traffic systems just don't work anymore, and everybody's trying to figure out the complexities of rights management. You buy rights to NFL, but then you buy to webcasts. Obviously, you can't. If you buy localized sporting event rights, you've got to control all your alternate forms of delivery to make sure it doesn't get outside with one of your bugs on it. It appears that on the business side, in conjunction with everybody trying to find some model, everybody's trying to find one workflow that publishes to all the forums, typically 30 to 40 different versions of content. Everybody's trying to figure out how to monetize that, and now everybody's trying to figure out how to change their billing systems to cope with that. So you can see where this whole chain came through. And I would say, versus any other year, people came down highly focused on those things. This is what the boss told me he wants to look at. Make more money with more of your content. So second screen, secondary content. A lot of talk about doing alternate productions for the same main event, particular sports. How we're going to do a different angle, different view, and provide alternate forms. Thought it was neat to see the usual groupie booths, as I call them, the Blackmagic, NewTek, Adobe, and GoPro. It seems that, I don't know whether they're customers or just a large fan base. Interesting discussions about SSD. More and more things are SSD. Certainly when you get into the on-demand services, adaptive bitrate. Finally, people could spell adaptive bitrate. And most people had it. Everybody had a clone for Elemental. That seems to be one vendor with a target on their back. Everybody else was coming out with, it's just like Elemental, but takes much less rack space and costs less, and heard that from a lot of different companies. And again, the kind of interesting that we've got a new SDI standard coming, and virtually, it's interesting, you found the one little bastion of it. People seem to be unaware of it. People don't seem to be talking about it. Along with the non-differentiation between UHD and 4K, it seems that I pointed out to a lot of people that we're not actually going to broadcast 4K. It's actually called UHD1.
One has less syllables.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I thought I needed some bug spray for all the drones that were flying around. It was interesting because when GoPro showed up, they started selling things off the booth, which horrified people. And I saw several people. There was the one maker that's selling a $9.95 white drone. And even on the plane ride home the following Monday, I saw like 2 people holding their drones that they had bought from NAB, and they were bought them for the kids. Boy, if you talk to any transmitter people, they were not having a good show. There were some real sad faces, people talking about different lines of work. I would say the RF business, was really you know, one guy was saying, yeah, I called my mother-in-law, so you should come by and visit, so we'd have some booth traffic. It's, interesting stuff. And comment about mobile, nothing about mobile. Nobody was talking about it at all. Everybody's talking about secondary, you know, ways to make secondary pieces of content, but nobody was actually expecting a little ATSC antenna to come up from the phone. I think that is, in fact, until you mentioned it, I didn't see any of it at all. Yeah, and again, just an overabundance of people trying to use the word cloud in as many senses as they could, and yet really not, I thought, coming up with practical. Anyways, I was a little cynical when I heard about cloud this and cloud that. But that's sort of my overview.
Great, thanks, Paul. Before I send it to the audience for questions, I wanted to ask a little bit about mobile handheld, because I know one of the booths we were at, they talked about LTE phones. I guess there's a new standard in the works that suddenly you would have that ability. My question to the panel is, if the phone on your belt can suddenly pick up, you know, direct streams rather than through the cellular networks, are you more likely to use it than you are today?
My comment is on content that's done, you know, we talked about a typical workflow in a MAM environment of your original 2-hour program, how it has a lot of graphics on it. You go to VOD and suddenly it's a lower bit rate, less graphics, and you kind of go down and down and down in terms of the treatment of that until you get to mobile, where the graphics tend to come up. You tend to use it for business, weather, sports, things like that. You know, maybe others will correct me here, but I see that still as a short view. Like, nobody sits down unless you're stuck in the dentist's office waiting or something. Nobody really sits down to watch anything of substance. It's something you watch for a short period of time. So I think probably the hard part of streaming is that it's just not something you just sit down and watch for longer periods of time. You're going to get a short burst of something, some clip, some bit of heavy graphical information along with that. And unless somebody thinks otherwise, I just don't know.
Anybody?
Well, you know, we've got two hats in our line. We've got the Bell proper mobility market. We've got the Bell media market. We go to meetings where we have conflicting interests. Right? So there's a worldwide trend, not just the United States, is to recover the UHF bandwidth for mobile, because everyone's convinced the government is more money in mobile applications than broadcast. So there's not likely to be any streaming to the handheld over broadcast, but there won't be any left. Right? They're doing the same thing in the C-band world. They're trying to jump and steal spectrum in the C-band world as well. So, you know, looking at our mobility side, there's no interest in integrating receivers that aren't LTE or next-gen mobile capable.
And do you think the fact that smartphones today now have 1920, 1080 screens, and, you know, especially the phablets are...
The trend now is 4K screens. 4K
exactly.
cameras on mobile.
So does maybe
that's
that...
the end of the year interest.
Does that change it now? Graphics are more readable in that.
I have to shyly admit to watching a movie on my phone with a plane ride back, so I suppose that is possible. But I would think you'd have to get episodic stuff down to 20 minutes or less that coincides with a subway ride or a bus ride.
Any other comments before we throw it out to the audience?
Maybe if I could just add something. The only way that I think this might take off is if it stays for free. Because everyone's always looking for free lunch or free buy, right? So for the college kid that can't afford television, cable television, you know, if the broadcast site is transmitting this thing and it's good content, it most likely has to be a live event. I can't see them watching Downton Abbey, for instance. You know, I can see that maybe taking off. But one thing that we have to remind ourselves is that, you know, for this to really work well, the transmitter has to be in the metropolitan area. It can't be out in the middle of nowhere. And I'll give you, for instance, I have a transmitter site that's 45 minutes out of downtown Winnipeg. That's a dead deal. It's not going to happen because everyone has a cell site will not be able to pick up that signal. It's 45 miles out of 45 kilometers outside of downtown Winnipeg. So the only way it's going to work is if CN Tower will work, maybe downtown Vancouver will work, but most geographical areas where transmitters aren't allowed to be in town, I think it brings the whole thing to a halt.
It's also a challenge for the manufacturers because you've got to design a two-way radio that works with maintaining their data and cell networks while also trying to maintain a separate band of hard to isolate the two.
So they do that now for GPS.
What's that?
They do that now for GPS.
It's a GPS, but I'm just saying from, this is what I've heard from the manufacturers, it adds complexity to the design of the phone. And considering we want to sell phones and change brands every 6 months, it's a costly thing to do to work longer.
And then now you have the digital tuners, which can scan almost any frequency you think of, and then you can also have digitally configured or software configured antennas, where they actually configure the patterns in the back of the thing you're holding to configure the antenna for the frequency you're looking at.
It's certainly doable, just it's a hard engineering challenge.
Yeah.
Right? You're trying to have both functions operate simultaneously. That's what I.
Yeah, I know the one vendor we saw talked about handoffs. You would pick up video through the cellular network, and then suddenly it would become a broadcast off a tower on the same LTE frequencies, potentially. Why don't we throw it out to the audience for questions on anything?
Andrew, maybe you want to throw up those pictures.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I apologize. Eric had a couple of
Well,
minor...
actually, the first one is just kind of a sad thing. No, not this one, but
Oh.
this was the NHK booth, by the
Oh.
way. But this one here was just sad. This was a little small company with a 16 by 16 booth selling 3D technology, and there was nobody in the booth. So if anybody's wondering about 3D, it was dead as a duck. This was the NHK booth, and as Paul said, what was it, 17 3-gig feeds?
It's 16 3 gigs.
16 3-gig feeds to the processor to make this 8K picture work.
All right, so at this point, I'd just like to throw it out to anybody for questions. We have
I have a two-part question for the whole panel. With the 4K, you did briefly mention it, how there's the two sets of standards. Has there been any talk of, I'm assuming everything's basically the Ultra HD 4K standard, but what about the harmonizing film PCI 4K standard? How do they do, are they just ignoring it and making it work? And then on top of that, what about frame rate? Where are they supporting, and I'm assuming they're going to be trying to go up to 120 frames a second eventually, maybe.
4K was original film.
Yeah, there won't be any change in the cinema guys will go their own way in terms of obviously they're not going to change the width. I don't know how many people know that the next Star Wars is being shot on film, but Disney decided to shoot on film. But the UHD 1 frame rate is specification is up to 300 frames per second. And you know, a lot of people, because of the refresh rates of the sets, they really think it doesn't start to become relevant until 120. So 10-bit 120 is where everybody's. There is part of the UHD standard, and I didn't hear it anywhere at the show, is the Rec 2020 color space that's replacing the 61701 color space. And I'll tell you, the one demonstration I've seen of it is, especially on the new curved 4K sets, is that it looks more 3D than 3D ever hoped it could. I mean, really, the subtle color changes, the depth of field that you perceive in it, especially on those curved screens. Also, actually, just another interesting sideline about 4K is a lot of companies make a lot of money on multi-viewers. In fact, some of those companies make most of their money on multi-viewers. We're just starting to see the first 4K multi-viewer, so you can easily put 32, if you look at replacing one screen with a 4K screen versus 4 1080 HD sets, the near field viewing characteristics of that one 4K screen is better than those 4 screens, like the lack of pixelization and whatnot. So that was actually one, I guess, maybe casualty of the thing you'll start to see is probably by the end of the year you'll start to see 4K multi-viewers come out. But anyways, back to the standard. It is up to 300. UHD 1 is really where where things are focused now on the television side, and it's really leaving the film. Like the Direct 2020 is the color space, the frame rates, and everything. It really isn't being consulted much at all on film guys.
Yeah, I think some of the 4K cameras just don't support that color space.
Yeah, it's probably, again, it's probably going to be the part that lags a lot behind because again, they'd have to redesign HDMI or whatever it is to actually be able to, once the set-top box is there, to be able to plug it in. And I'll tell you, there seems to be a big disjoint between the consumer industry right now in terms of who's going to come up with the right format to plug your TV in.
Ultra HD1 will be the TV format.
Yeah.
Right, it's 4 times HD process.
What about DisplayPort?
So I went to CES this year, and they had the various booths for the consortiums were there. So there was the HDMI consortium and the DisplayPort consortium. So I don't pretend to know which one's going to win, but right now, you know, my son's 4K gaming computer that he built several months ago now uses a dual DisplayPort, and had I spent the money for the card he really wanted, it would have had 4 DisplayPorts out. He's got a monitor with dual DisplayPort out, DisplayPort in, watch games on 4K.
Interestingly, there's some wireless technology coming as well. 802.11ad, I think it is in 60 gig range, which kind of blew me away. And it's going to have the capability of actually transmitting a 4K picture with sound. And they were saying not great distances, so you can sort of go from your mobile device to the television and throw it to the television. So, but I stood up and asked, what about health concerns? Anybody thought about, here we are with 60 gig energy that we're throwing about the room, and 10 watts as well, which is quite a bit. But I think right now they're just trying to master the technology, not worrying too much about the health benefits. But maybe that's a good question for everybody. Does anybody worry about the amount of Wi-Fi we're dealing with?
Just wait till remote charging the vehicles on the road.
Start wiring things, I guess.
One of the sleepers out there is wireless technology. Like, you know, a lot more on wireless.
Any other questions in the audience? Just, you all brought up IP in the plant. You know, it's been used for distribution for a while, but, you know, and there were different, you know, the Evertz product where you're basically replacing a traditional router with just IP ports versus the Snell/Cisco and other vendors who weren't showing publicly, but they're suggesting you put switches throughout the facility. What do you think? I mean, how far off is this putting in your plant? Obviously, there's some standards there's some standards in place, but standards being considered. Is this something that'll happen the next couple of years?
It sort of speaks to what Jim was talking about in terms of generic computer-based equipment, not purpose-built. Well, SDI is really purpose-built. So will it survive over an IP transmission? I don't know. That's a great question.
You need a production switch with IP interfaces. You need all the infrastructure of the plant with IP interfaces, and most do not have IP interfaces.
Does it start as a hybrid model, though, where you have modules that convert your
Like
four?
in some cases, like ESPN, for example, you know, they have an IP router, and they're using it for monitoring because the sources coming in are already transport streams under IP. They don't have to convert them to IP because they are IP. So if you're, you know, if you're in a production environment, it's all baseband, so you have to encode it. Every input, every output would have to be encoded. That's very cost prohibitive, so it's not cost effective.
But I agree with Jim. I just think it's a matter of time. You know, at IBC last year, there was a production switcher that had basically Ethernet connections on the back and nothing else. And so their take was that, you know, this is coming and they want to be the first ones out. But again, you know, if I use the radio analogy, you know, there's a lot of encoding and decoding that they have. So that for instance, you're always going to have an analog mic at one point or another. So they went from an analog source to A to D, and as soon as it became digital, it became an Ethernet connection back to into a blade someplace, and it was either went back to a central Ethernet switch, like a Cisco type switch, or for radio typically it goes back to a central switch, right? But I see, you know, as networks get more and more powerful, that you don't have to have a central network switch anymore because anything should be available to the other source.
Where it becomes cost effective though is when you can actually start mapping baseband into IP without encoding. So if you got 10 gig and 100 gig network, you don't need encoding. So then it becomes a lot less costly.
The way I saw that one in the radio area, SAS had a non-switch based platform, right? But the expansion was an issue there, whereas if you went with Wheatstone and you bought the switch, then adding more controllers down the line is probably an easier proposition. Or maybe just a planning issue.
I think it is, yeah. But I think definitely that moving production facilities to an IP infrastructure is just 5, maybe 10 years out.
And then one last thing I wanted to touch on, unless we have any other questions from the audience, was just the cloud. So, Paul, for broadcast, you don't think it's the way to go? Are there any other thoughts?
And what I mean by that is it's just interesting to see how many broadcasters would actually give up their own facilities to have somebody host them in a cloud. And I think I tend to use the word virtualization just because floating software licenses, and given some of the client base here, they have plenty of their own cloud that get somebody else's.
And the problem with services is that services is, you know, finance world, we've got CapEx and we've got OpEx. CapEx does not affect your bottom line, OpEx does. So if you rent all the services and pay ongoing operating fees, it's not good for the bottom line. So it's a lot easier to invest in our network. It's in the Bell world, that's our model.
So, on that tone, if the Bell world owns a lot of server infrastructure, as does Rogers and other people, does it make sense to use some of that IT infrastructure for storage rather than going out buying a traditional broadcast server in your plant?
I don't know if anybody listened to the Irrelevant show on the weekend, where there was a guy who went to his dealer to get wiring for his printer, and the dealer was saying, no, I guess I'll sell it to you. And he said, but when I first came here, it was free. And of course, the printer was a low price, but buying the ink was as much as the printer. What's the point? So at some point, they're going to have to monetize the cloud. And having these great server farms and supplying up that content ain't going to be free forever. So I think that there is a reckoning to be had down the line if we go down that road.
Even the trend towards subscription models, like Adobe's done it, they'll have this talking about doing it as well. So people want to make money. Vendors want to make money, we want to save money.
And just out of curiosity, I did have one of our vendors within Rogers price out a cloud solution for one of our broadcast sites. And it really was a learning experience for this vendor, who was a very mature vendor. They could not understand our throughput. They just could not get what we were trying to push down these pipes to get